The tin box fell from the attic rafter with a sound like thunder, spilling photographs and yellowed papers across the wooden floor where Henrik Andersen knelt in the January cold of 1973. One image stopped his breath, a Wehrmacht officer's face staring back through 28 years of dust, wearing the exact scar Henrik remembered tracing on his best friend's cheek. Snow hissed against the farmhouse window in Lillehammer as Henrik's daughter called from downstairs, her voice bright with wedding plans, unaware that the man she'd mourned as her father every November 11th might never have existed at all. The box had been sealed since May 1945, hidden beneath insulation in a house Henrik thought held no more secrets. Inside, German identity papers, a Kriegsmarine logbook, and a letter addressed to Marta in handwriting he'd watched pen recipes and lullabies for 18 years. His hands shook as he lifted the photograph again. The scar, the eyes, the exact tilt of the jaw. But the uniform told a different story than the Norwegian resistance fighter he'd buried in the spring mud of Narvik. Before we go further, pause for just a moment and tell us in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? If this story has already pulled you in, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the mysteries that change everything. Henrik Andersen had been 23 when the war ended. A rail-thin farm boy from Uppland who'd spent 4 years running ammunition through frozen forests and sleeping in barns that smelled of hay and fear. His best friend, the man he knew as Lars Hagen, had been the one who taught him to move without sound, to read German patrol patterns in the bend of cigarette smoke, to believe that Norway would be free again. They'd fought side by side through the winter of '44, through ambushes and supply raids, through nights so cold their breath crystallized on their scarves. When Lars took a bullet through the lung in April '45, 3 weeks before liberation, Henrik held him as he died on the roadside near Björkvik, promising to find his infant daughter and raise her as his own. Her name is Marta, Lars had whispered, blood flecking his lips. In Tromsø. The woman who keeps her. Tell her I kept my word. Henrik had kept his. He'd walked 70 kilometers north after the Germans surrendered, found the trembling 18-year-old girl sheltering a 6-month-old baby in a fisherman's shack, and brought them both home to Lillehammer. He married the girl, Anna, because it was the right thing to do, because Marta needed a mother and a name that wouldn't draw questions. They built a quiet life. Anna learned to love him, or at least to need him. Marta grew up believing Henrik was her father and that her birth father had died a hero. For 28 years, that story had been the foundation of everything. Now, kneeling in attic dust, with a German officer's face staring up at him, Henrik felt the foundation crack. The identity card read, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, Kriegsmarine Intelligence, Hamburg. The logbook contained coordinates, names of Norwegian resistance cells, dates that aligned too perfectly with raids Henrik remembered. Raids where good men had died because someone had whispered their locations to the enemy. And the letter. My dearest Marta, if you are reading this, I have failed to return. Know that everything I did, every lie, every betrayal, was to buy you time. The war is lost, but you are not. Trust the Norwegian. He is a fool, but he is good. Let him raise you. Forget me. Your father, the attic seemed to tilt. Lars Hagen had never existed. The man Henrik mourned, the brother he'd trusted with his life, had been a German intelligence officer embedded so deeply in the resistance that even Henrik, who'd slept in the same barns, shared the same crusts of bread, had never suspected. And Marta, his Marta, downstairs planning her wedding, laughing on the telephone. She was the daughter of a spy. But there was something else in the box, something that made Henrik's stomach turn. A second photograph, this one of a woman he didn't recognize, dark-haired and severe, standing beside Klaus Richter in what looked like a Berlin studio. On the back, in the same handwriting, Greta, 1942. Not Anna. So who was Anna? And if Klaus Richter had a wife in Germany, what did that make the girl Henrik had married? The woman who'd trembled when she handed him the baby and said, "He told me you'd come." Henrik sat back on his heels, the cold seeping through his trousers. Downstairs, Marta laughed again, the sound so familiar it hurt. He had two choices: burn the box and let the past stay buried, or follow the thread and discover what kind of man he'd really called his friend. But as he reached for the lighter in his pocket, a final item slid from the envelope: a military commendation, signed by a German colonel, dated October 1944. For exceptional service in the capture and execution of 12 Norwegian resistance operatives. 12 men. Henrik knew their names. He'd been there when they died. And now he understood. Lars, Klaus, hadn't just been a spy. He'd been the one who'd killed them. The lighter slipped from Henrik's fingers. What else had Klaus Richter done before that bullet found him on the road to Björkvik? And who had really pulled the trigger? Henrik descended the attic stairs with the tin box clutched against his chest, each step creaking beneath him like the groan of a ship taking water. The question burning through his mind wasn't whether to tell Marta. It was whether Anna had known all along. In the kitchen, sunlight slanted through lace curtains onto the worn table where 3 generations had shared meals. Anna stood at the stove, stirring porridge with the methodical rhythm of decades, her gray hair pinned in the same style she'd worn since 1945. She looked up as Henrik entered, and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or dread. "You found something," she said. Not a question. Henrik set the box on the table between them. The wooden spoon in Anna's hand went still. Her face, weathered by Norwegian winters and the quiet erosion of secrets, turned the color of old parchment. She didn't ask what was inside. She already knew. "How long?" Henrik's voice came out hoarse. Anna lowered herself into a chair, her movements careful, as if her bones might shatter. "Since the beginning." The admission hit him like a fist. "You knew he was German. I knew he was a liar." Anna's hands folded in her lap, fingers knotted together. "But I didn't know about the men who died. You have to believe that, Henrik. I didn't know about the blood." Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, the sound muffled by snow. Inside, the silence stretched taut as wire. Henrik opened the box and placed the photograph of Klaus Richter in his Wehrmacht uniform on the table. "Then tell me what you did know." Anna's story unfolded slowly, like a scar opening. She'd met Klaus in the winter of '43 when she was 16 and working in her uncle's cannery in Tromsø. He'd arrived with forged papers claiming to be a Swedish merchant avoiding conscription, charming and confident in a way that made the Norwegian boys seem clumsy by comparison. By spring, she was pregnant. By summer, he'd disappeared. "He came back in October," Anna said, her voice distant. "Different. Harder. He said he'd been working with the resistance, that he'd done things he couldn't talk about. I believed him because I needed to." She looked at Henrik then, her eyes red-rimmed. "Because the alternative was that I'd given myself to a monster." Klaus had returned twice more before April '45, once to see Marta after she was born, once to leave the tin box. Each time, he'd stayed less than an hour, always watching the roads, always armed. The last time he told me that if anything happened to him, a Norwegian named Henrik Andersen would come for Marta. He said you were good. Simple, but good. He said you'd never question the story because you wanted to believe in heroes. The words landed like stones. He was right, Anna whispered. You never questioned anything. Henrik felt something crack inside his chest. Not anger, not yet, but a vast and terrible weariness. He'd spent 28 years building a life on a foundation of lies, and the woman sitting across from him had helped pour the concrete. Did you love him? He asked. Anna's laugh was bitter. I was 16 and stupid. I don't know if what I felt was love or just desperation. She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of Henrik's hand. But I learned to love you. That part was real. Henrik pulled back. The woman in the photograph. Greta. Who is she? His wife. Anna's voice fractured. I didn't know about her until he left the box. He had a whole life in Hamburg. A wife, a son, a house near the harbor. We were just insurance, I think. A backup identity if the war went wrong. The porridge on the stove began to burn, filling the kitchen with an acrid smell. Neither of them moved. Upstairs, Marta's footsteps crossed the bedroom floor. In 2 hours, she'd leave for her seamstress appointment, excited about lace patterns and hemlines, unaware that her father's ghost had just become something else entirely. Henrik stared at the documents scattered across the table. The logbook, the commendation, the letter. The 12 men, he said slowly. The ones Klaus betrayed. I knew them. Anna's face crumpled. Henrik, Petter Johansson, Olaf Berg, Magnus Vik. The names rose from a place Henrik had tried to bury. We planned a supply raid in October 44. Someone leaked our position to a German patrol. We walked into an ambush. His voice dropped. I survived because I'd stopped to fix my boot. 12 men died in the crossfire. We thought it was bad luck. Maybe it was, Anna said desperately. Maybe Klaus didn't. The commendation is dated 3 days after the ambush. Henrik's finger stabbed the document. He was rewarded for their deaths. The dog outside stopped barking. The kitchen clock ticked. Anna's breathing came shallow and quick, the sound of someone drowning on dry land. What are you going to tell her? She finally asked. Henrik looked toward the stairs where Marta's humming drifted down. A wedding song, something old and hopeful. His daughter. Not his blood, but his in every way that mattered. He'd taught her to ride a bicycle, to gut a fish, to navigate by stars. He'd sat beside her bed through fevers and nightmares. He'd walked her through grief when she thought she was mourning a hero. I don't know, he said. But even as he spoke, another question gnawed at him. If Klaus Richter had been so embedded in the resistance, how had he died? The official story was a firefight with retreating Germans near Bjerkvik in late April 45. But Henrik had been there. He'd held Klaus, Lars, as he bled out. And now, with 28 years of distance, Henrik remembered something he'd pushed aside at the time. The angle of the wound. The way Klaus's eyes had fixed on him with something that looked less like pain and more like relief. The fact that no other Germans had been found in the area. Someone had executed Klaus Richter. And Henrik was beginning to suspect it hadn't been the enemy. What if the resistance had discovered the truth? What if someone had known Klaus was a spy and put a bullet in him before he could run? And if that was true, who had known? And why had they let Henrik adopt the traitor's child? Henrik left Anna sitting in the kitchen and drove his truck 20 kilometers east to a farmhouse he hadn't visited in 15 years. The road carved through pine forests still heavy with January snow, each turn pulling him deeper into a past he'd thought was settled. Gunnar Olsen had been the resistance cell's leader, the man who'd given the orders, planned the raids, kept them alive through 4 years of occupation. He'd also been the one who'd told Henrik where to find Lars's body on that April morning in 45. At 71, Gunnar still worked his family's land, a stooped figure Henrik spotted immediately, splitting wood behind a barn that smelled of motor oil and ancient hay. Henrik Andersson. Gunnar didn't look up from his axe stroke. Thought you'd come eventually. The words hung in the frozen air like a confession. Henrik's boots crunched across the snow-packed yard. You knew. We all knew. Gunnar drove the axe into a fresh log, the crack echoing off the barn walls. Not at first, but by March 45, we knew enough. He finally turned, his face deeply lined, eyes sharp as the blade in his hands. Question is, what took you so long? Henrik felt the ground shift beneath him again. How many? 4 of us. Myself, Eric Dahl, Sindre Haugen, and your friend Petter's brother, Tobias. We started suspecting after the October ambush. Too many raids going wrong. Too many times the Germans knew exactly where to wait. Gunnar's jaw worked. We set a trap in March. Gave Klaus false information about a weapons cache. Germans showed up 6 hours later. The winter sun cast long shadows across the farmyard. You killed him, Henrik said. Tobias did. Gunnar's voice was flat, factual. Shot him clean through the lung on the road to Björkvik. We staged it to look like he'd been hit in a firefight. Let him die slow enough to say his goodbyes, in case there was anything human left in him. He spat into the snow. He used his last words to make you promise to find his daughter. Manipulative bastard to the end. Henrik's hands clenched. And you let me adopt her. You let me raise a traitor's child without telling me the truth. What would you have done differently? Gunnar challenged. Left a baby to starve? Punished an infant for her father's sins? He set down the axe. We made a choice, Henrik. Let the child live. Let you believe your friend died honorably, and close that chapter. The war was ending. We were tired. 12 men died because of him. 12 men died because war is hell and trust is a luxury we couldn't afford. Gunnar moved closer, his breath fogging in the cold. But that baby girl didn't pull the trigger. She didn't whisper coordinates to the enemy. She was 6 months old and innocent. Henrik wanted to argue, to rage, but the logic was inescapable. Why didn't you tell me after, when the war was over? Gunnar's expression softened slightly. Because you needed to believe something good had survived. Because Marta needed a father who loved her without reservation. And because, frankly, we thought you'd never find out. He paused. Where did you find the box? Attic. Hidden in the rafters. Klaus's insurance policy. He probably figured if you found it after enough years had passed, the truth wouldn't matter anymore. Gunnar shook his head. He was wrong. Henrik drove back through the forest as the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting the snow in shades of amber and blood. His mind churned through decades of moments he'd lived one way, but now had to understand differently. Every story he'd told Marta about her brave father. Every November 11th when they'd visited the memorial stone Henrik had commissioned, carved with Lars Hagen's name. Every time Marta had looked at him with pride and said, I'm glad he had you as a friend. It had all been built on a script written by a German intelligence officer who'd calculated that Henrik's goodness could be weaponized. When he reached Lillehammer, instead of driving home, Henrik turned toward the town cemetery. The memorial stone sat in the section reserved for resistance fighters surrounded by Norwegian flags and frost-killed flowers from the previous November. Henrik had chosen the inscription himself. Lars Hagen, 1920-1945. He died so Norway could live. Lies carved in granite. Henrik knelt in the snow, his knees pressing into the cold. "I should hate you," he said to the stone. "You got 12 good men killed. You lied to everyone who trusted you. You used your daughter as a prop in whatever game you were playing." A crow called from a nearby pine. "But Marta!" Henrik's voice cracked. "She's the best thing I ever did. The only thing I'm certain I got right." He pulled the Wehrmacht photograph from his coat and stared at Klaus Richter's face. The scar, the eyes, the uniform that represented everything Norway had fought against. "You were a monster," Henrik said, "but you gave me her." The paradox was unbearable. He couldn't undo 28 years of love because the origin story was poisoned. He couldn't look at Marta's face, so much like the man in this photograph, and see only betrayal. She was innocent, but she was also the living evidence of Klaus Richter's existence, a walking reminder that Henrik's entire adult life had been shaped by a lie. What would happen when she learned the truth? Would she see herself differently? Would she feel the taint of her father's crimes in her own blood? Would she look at Henrik and wonder if his love had always been conditional, a promise made to a dying man rather than a choice made from the heart? Henrik didn't have answers, but as he knelt there in the snow, he realized something else. Anna had carried this secret for 28 years. She'd woken up every morning knowing her daughter's father was a war criminal, watching Henrik grieve a man who'd never existed, building a marriage on a foundation of necessary lies. The weight must have been crushing. He returned home as evening darkened into night. Marta's car was gone, still at the seamstress probably, still choosing lace, still innocent. Anna met him at the door, her face drawn. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Gunnar told me everything." Henrik removed his coat, his movements slow. "4 men knew. They executed Klaus and let me believe he died a hero." Anna nodded, unsurprised. "They came to see me once after you brought Marta home. Warned me that if I ever told you the truth, they'd make sure everyone in Lillehammer knew what Klaus had done. They said it was for Marta's protection." Her voice hardened. "But it was for yours too. They knew it would destroy you." They were right. Henrik moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered fields that had been in his family for 5 generations. Solid, unchanging. Everything he'd tried to give Marta. "She deserves to know," he said. "She deserves peace," Anna countered. "She's getting married in 4 months. She's happy. Why poison that?" "Because it's the truth." "The truth is a luxury, Henrik. We survived the war by learning when to lie." Anna joined him at the window. "Klaus was a monster, but Marta isn't. She's ours." The possessive pronoun hung between them, ours, not his. And Henrik realized that was the real question. Who did Marta belong to? The dead German spy who'd supplied her genetic code, or the Norwegian farmer who'd taught her to tie her shoes and believed in her goodness even when the world was dark? Biology or choice? Blood or love? Henrik had always believed love was stronger. But standing in his kitchen with a box full of damning evidence, he wasn't sure anymore. "There's something else," Anna said quietly. "In the box. Did you find the second letter?" Henrik frowned. "What second letter?" Anna's face went pale. "Then you didn't see everything." She moved to the table and lifted the tin box, running her fingers along the inside seam until something clicked. A false bottom swung open, Inside lay a single envelope addressed in Klaus Richter's handwriting. To Henrik Andersen, if fate is cruel enough to let you find this. Henrik's hands trembled as he broke the seal. What could Klaus possibly have left to say? The letter was written in Norwegian, the handwriting precise despite the confession it contained. Henrik read it standing at the kitchen table while Anna watched, her face carved from worry and dread. Henrik, if you are reading this, you have learned what I was. Not who, because who implies humanity, and I forfeited that claim long ago. I was a mechanism of the Reich, a weapon pointed at your country, and I fulfilled my function with efficiency that earned commendations I did not deserve. You will want to know why. There is no why that will satisfy you. I believed in nothing except survival. When the Kriegsmarine recruited me for intelligence work in 1941, I accepted because the alternative was the Eastern Front. Norway seemed preferable to freezing in a Russian trench. The lies came easily. The accent, the mannerisms, the friendship, all tools I deployed without conscience. But then there was Marta. I did not plan for her. Anna was a mistake, a moment of weakness disguised as loneliness. When she told me she was pregnant, I should have disappeared. Instead, I returned. 3 times. The last time I held my daughter and felt something I had not felt since childhood, terror that was not about my own death, but about hers. The Reich was collapsing. I knew I would not survive. The Norwegians were closing in. I could see it in your eyes, Henrik, even if you could not see the truth in mine. So I made a calculation, not a redemption, because men like me do not earn redemption. A transaction. I chose you because you were decent, predictable, the kind of man who keeps promises even when they cost him everything. I knew you would come for Marta. I knew you would raise her to believe in goodness, even though her father embodied the opposite. You may think I manipulated you. You would be correct. But manipulation in service of my daughter's survival is the only thing I have ever done that approached virtue. By now you have learned about the 12 men. You have seen the commendation. You know I traded their lives for German approval of my cover. I will not insult you with excuses. They were good men, and I killed them as surely as if I had pulled the triggers myself. Petter Johansson sang folk songs. Olaf Berg carved small animals from driftwood. Magnus Vick had a daughter Marta's age. I remember all their names. That is my punishment, Henrik. Not guilt, because I am too broken for guilt, but memory. I carry them with me into whatever judgment waits beyond death. What I ask now is impossible, and I have no right to ask it. Do not tell Marta. Let her believe I was Lars Hagen. Let her believe I died for something noble. She is innocent of my crimes, and innocence is too rare to poison unnecessarily. If you must hate me completely. I have earned it, but love her purely. She deserves nothing less. Klaus Richter, April 1945. Henrik set down the letter, his hands shaking. The audacity of it, the cold calculation even, in confession, made him want to tear the paper into pieces. But beneath the rage was something worse. Recognition. Klaus had been right about him. Every prediction, every assumption about Henrik's character had been accurate. He was predictable. He did keep promises. He had raised Marta to believe in goodness, and now Klaus was asking him to continue the lie. He knew you'd find it eventually, Anna said quietly. He planned for this moment. He planned everything. Henrik's voice was hollow. Even his own death. He must have known Gunnar and the others were onto him. He could have run, disappeared into Germany before they caught him. But he stayed. Because of Marta, Anna finished. He stayed long enough to arrange her future, to make you promise. Henrik moved to the window, watching snow begin to fall again, thick flakes catching the porch light. Somewhere in Lillehammer, his daughter was laughing with her seamstress, holding up white fabric, imagining her wedding day, innocent, protected by lies. What kind of man does that make me? Henrik asked, if I keep lying to her. The kind who puts his daughter's happiness above his own need to be right. Anna joined him, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. Klaus was a monster. But he was right about one thing. Marta is innocent, and innocence once lost can never be recovered. The decision crystallized slowly over the next 3 days. Henrik burned nothing. He returned the tin box to the attic, sealing it behind the rafters where it had waited for 28 years. But he didn't tell Marta. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Instead, he began a quieter investigation. He drove to Tromsø, to the cannery where Anna had worked in '43. The building was abandoned now, windows broken, the smell of old fish and rust clinging to the walls. He spoke to elderly neighbors who remembered a Swedish merchant who'd been too handsome for his own good, and a young girl who'd gotten pregnant and moved south. No one remembered anything useful. He visited the National Archives in Oslo, requesting German military records from the occupation. The clerk, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, brought him boxes of documents, patrol logs, intelligence reports, personnel files. He found Klaus Richter's name 3 times, once in a transfer order from Hamburg to Tromsø in November '42, once in a commendation signed by a Colonel Steiner, and once in a death notice filed by the Norwegian Provisional Government in May '45. Klaus Richter, Oberleutnant, killed in action near Björkvik. No remains recovered. No remains, because Gunnar and the others had made sure the body disappeared. Henrik photographed every document, building a file he wasn't sure what to do with. On the 4th day, he received a visitor. Tobias Johansson arrived without warning, parking a battered Volvo in Henrik's driveway and walking to the door with the careful gait of a man whose knees had frozen too many times in wartime, winters. He was 68, Petter's younger brother, the man who'd pulled the trigger on Klaus Richter. "Gunnar told me you came asking questions," Tobias said when Henrik opened the door. "Figured I owed you a conversation." They sat in the kitchen, where Anna served coffee in silence before retreating upstairs. Tobias stirred his cup slowly, not drinking. "I've thought about that day every day for 28 years. Wondered if we did the right thing. Letting him speak to you. Letting you make that promise." "Did you?" Henrik asked. "I don't know." Tobias finally looked up. "My brother Petter died in that ambush. He was 31. Had a wife and 2 boys. When we figured out Klaus had sold us out, I wanted to kill him slow, make him suffer for every name on our memorial stones. But you didn't. Gunnar wouldn't let me. Said we were liberators, not executioners. Said we'd be no better than the Germans if we tortured a man, even a traitor." Tobias's jaw tightened. "So I gave him a clean death. 1 bullet. Quick. More mercy than he deserved." Henrik thought of Klaus's final moments. The way he'd gripped Henrik's hand, the blood on his lips, the relief in his eyes. "Did he say anything before you shot him?" He said, "Tell Henrik I'm sorry I wasn't the man he thought I was." Tobias laughed bitterly, as if sorry could resurrect 12 good men. They sat in silence, 2 old soldiers carrying different pieces of the same terrible knowledge. "Are you going to tell Marta?" Tobias finally asked. "Would you, if she were yours?" Tobias considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. My boys know their father died in the resistance. That knowledge has shaped their entire lives, made them proud, given them something to live up to. If I told them Petter died because his best friend betrayed him, it wouldn't change the past. It would only poison their present. So you think I should lie? I think, Tobias said carefully, that truth is a tool. Sometimes it builds. Sometimes it destroys. You have to decide what you're trying to build. After Tobias left, Henrik sat alone in the darkening kitchen. Anna's words echoed. She deserves peace. Klaus's words echoed, do not tell Marta. Gunnar's words echoed, we were tired. But beneath all of it, Henrik heard his own voice from 28 years ago, kneeling in the spring mud beside a dying man. I promise. He'd kept that promise. He'd raised Marta with love and patience. He'd given her a childhood filled with warmth despite the war's shadow. He'd walked her through grief and helped her build a life. And now she was happy. Getting married. Planning a future. Innocent of the sins that had purchased her survival. Did she have a right to know the truth? Or did she have a right to keep her peace? Henrik didn't have an answer. But as he climbed the stairs to return the documents to the attic, he passed Marta's childhood bedroom, unchanged since she'd moved to her own apartment in town, and saw the drawings, still pinned to the walls. Crayon pictures of their farm, a family portrait she'd made at age 8. Henrik, Anna, and Marta holding hands beneath a smiling sun. No monsters in that picture, only love. And Henrik realized that Klaus Richter had been right about one final thing. Some lies were kinder than the truth. But outside, the snow continued to fall, and in the morning, Marta would arrive for Sunday dinner. And Henrik would have to look into her eyes and decide whether kindness was the same as cowardice. What would you do if the truth in your hands could shatter the person you loved most? Marta arrived on Sunday with her fiancé, Eric, a gentle schoolteacher from Hamar, who read poetry and built furniture in his spare time, and news that made Anna weep with joy. We've moved up the wedding, Marta announced, her face radiant in the winter light streaming through the kitchen windows. April 23rd instead of June. Eric's father is ill, and we want him to be there. April 23rd. 28 years to the day after Klaus Richter died on the road to Bjerkvik. Henrik felt the coincidence like a punch, but he forced a smile and embraced his daughter while Anna fussed over wedding details, and Eric shook his hand with the earnest grip of a young man determined to prove himself worthy. Over dinner, roasted lamb and potatoes, the smell of rosemary and butter filling the house. Marta talked about the dress she'd chosen, the simple ceremony they'd planned, the small cabin Eric had found near Hamar where they'd begin their life together. I wish my real father could have been there, Marta said quietly, the way she always did when weddings or milestones approached. But I'm grateful I'll have you, Papa. Papa. The name she'd called him since she could speak. Henrik's throat tightened. I wouldn't miss it for the world. After dinner, Eric helped Anna with dishes while Henrik and Marta walked the property, their boots crunching through snow that sparkled under a full moon. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Are you happy? Henrik asked. More than I knew was possible. Marta's smile was unguarded, full of the uncomplicated joy Henrik had worked 28 years to protect. Eric is kind. He listens. He doesn't try to fix me. He just loves me as I am. He's a good man. Like you. Marta squeezed his arm. You taught me what to look for in a partner, how to recognize honesty, how to value steadiness over flash. She paused by the fence line, looking out over fields silvered by moonlight. I know my birth father was brave, that he died fighting for Norway. But you're the one who showed me how to live. That matters more than anything. Henrik felt his carefully constructed resolve begin to crack. She deserved to know, but she also deserved her joy. Marta, he began, then stopped. She turned, her face concerned. Papa, are you all right? He looked at her. This woman he'd raised, who'd learned to walk holding his fingers, who'd cried on his shoulder after her first heartbreak, who'd inherited nothing of Klaus Richter except the shape of her face and the color of her eyes. Everything else was Henrik's work, Anna's work, the product of choice and love and countless small moments that had nothing to do with blood. I'm proud of you, he said instead. Whatever happens, I want you to know that. Marta laughed, puzzled but pleased. You're being sentimental. It's just a wedding, not a funeral. But Henrik heard the echo of another wedding, his and Anna's 28 years ago, a marriage of necessity that had somehow transformed into something real. Maybe that was the point. Maybe love wasn't about origins. It was about what you built despite them. 2 weeks later, Henrik received a phone call that changed everything again. The voice on the line was cultured, speaking Norwegian with a slight German accent. Herr Andersen, my name is Thomas Richter. I believe you knew my father. Henrik's blood turned to ice. I don't know anyone by that name. Please, I mean no harm. I only recently discovered that my father had another life during the war. A daughter named Marta, my half-sister. Thomas's voice carried genuine emotion. I would like to meet her if possible, to apologize for what my father did, to offer whatever reconciliation I can. Henrik gripped the phone so hard his knuckles went white. How did you find me? German military archives are being declassified. I hired a researcher after my mother died last year and left behind letters my father had sent from Norway. It took months to piece together the truth. Thomas paused. I understand if you refuse, but I'm traveling to Oslo next month for business. If Marta wishes to meet, I will be at the Grand Hotel on the 15th of March. The line went dead. Henrik stood motionless in his kitchen, the receiver still pressed to his ear, his mind racing. Klaus Richter's legitimate son. The boy who'd grown up in Hamburg with his mother Greta, who'd probably been told his father died heroically during the war, who now knew enough truth to come looking for the family Klaus had hidden in Norway. Anna appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Who was that? Klaus's son. He wants to meet Marta. The words hung in the air like smoke. Anna sank into a chair. Does he know what Klaus did? I don't know, but he knows about Marta. Henrik set down the phone. If we tell her no, she'll ask why. If we tell her yes, she'll ask questions. Either way, the truth comes out. Then we tell her first, Anna said firmly. Before this stranger does. On our terms. With context. Henrik wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. The decision had been made for them. They invited Marta to dinner 3 days later, asking her to come alone. She arrived curious and slightly concerned, sensing something in Anna's voice that suggested this wasn't a casual meal. Henrik had spent 72 hours rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd explain. But as Marta settled at the kitchen table where she'd eaten thousands of meals, all his preparations dissolved. There's something we need to tell you about your father, he began. Marta's expression shifted immediately. Confusion, then wariness. My father? But he died before I was born. What could there possibly be to tell after all these years? Henrik exchanged a glance with Anna, who nodded almost imperceptibly. And then, with Marta sitting in the lamplight where she'd done her homework and shared her dreams and become the person Henrik loved most in the world, he told her everything: the tin box, the photographs, the German identity papers, the 12 men who'd died, the execution on the road to Björkvik, the 28-year lie. Marta listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Henrik finished, the silence was absolute. Then Marta stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the darkness. "You've known for 3 weeks," she finally said, her voice hollow. "And you didn't tell me. I was trying to protect you." "From what? The truth?" Marta turned, and Henrik saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm 28 years old, Papa. I'm not a child anymore. You don't get to decide what I can handle." "Marta, please." "Was any of it real?" Her voice broke. "The stories you told me about him, the memorial stone, the way you'd talk about his bravery every November 11th? "The love was real," Anna said quietly. "Everything Henrik gave you, that was real. But it was built on a lie." Marta's hands shook. "My entire identity, the pride I felt in my father's sacrifice, the way I've carried his memory, all of it was a fiction written by a German spy who murdered Norwegian resistance fighters." Henrik moved toward her. "You are not your father's sins. You are—" "What am I, Papa? Who am I, if not Lars Hagen's daughter?" Marta's face crumpled. "I'm the child of a traitor, the daughter of a man who got 12 good men killed. How do I live with that?" "The way you've always lived," Henrik said desperately. "With kindness, with integrity, with all the goodness that has nothing to do with Klaus Richter and everything to do with the person you chose to become." But Marta was already moving toward the door, grabbing her coat. "I need time," she said. "I need to think." "Marta, wait, there's more. Klaus's son called. He wants to meet you." She froze, her hand on the doorknob. "His son. Your half-brother, Thomas. He's coming to Oslo in March." Marta laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Of course he is. Of course there's more family I didn't know existed." She pulled open the door, letting in a blast of cold air. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Papa. I don't know if I can forgive any of you." She left, the door closing with a finality that made Henrik's chest ache. Anna came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "She'll come back," Anna whispered. "She just needs time." But as they stood in their empty kitchen, Henrik wasn't sure. He'd broken the one thing he'd sworn to protect, Marta's faith in the world. And outside, the snow fell harder, erasing tracks and covering the ground in a cold white blanket that looked like peace but hid everything beneath. Marta didn't return for 2 weeks. She called Anna once, briefly, to say she was staying with Eric and needed space to process everything. The wedding was still on. "I won't let Klaus Richter take that from me too," she said, but she wasn't ready to see Henrik yet. The distance carved a hollow in Henrik's chest that grew deeper with each passing day. He worked the farm mechanically, repairing fences that didn't need repair, reorganizing the barn, anything to keep his hands busy while his mind spiraled. At night, he lay awake listening to Anna's breathing and wondering if he'd made the right choice telling Marta the truth, or if he should have burned the tin box and let the past stay buried. On the 14th of March, the day before Thomas Richter was due to arrive in Oslo, Marta appeared at the farmhouse door. She looked thinner, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, but her expression was calmer, resolved. "I'm going to meet him," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow. And I want you to come with me." Henrik felt something loosen in his chest, Are you sure? No, but I need to see this through. Marta stepped inside, accepting the coffee Anna wordlessly offered. I've spent 2 weeks reading everything I could find about the occupation, about collaboration, about what it meant to survive when choosing sides could get you killed. She wrapped her hands around the mug, and I realized something. Klaus Richter made his choices, but I don't have to carry them. I'm not defined by his blood. I'm defined by what I do with the life he inadvertently gave me. Henrik heard the echo of his own thoughts in her words. You sound like your mother, Anna said softly. I sound like both of you. Marta met Henrik's eyes. I'm still angry. I'm still hurt that you kept this from me for 3 weeks. But I understand why you did it. And I understand that you've spent 28 years loving me despite knowing what you knew about Anna's past with Klaus. I never knew, Henrik said. Not until you knew Anna had been with a man who abandoned her. You knew I wasn't your blood. You chose to love us anyway. Marta set down her coffee. That's the kind of father I needed. Not a dead hero, but a living man who showed up every day and chose us. The words broke something open in Henrik that he hadn't known was sealed shut. They took the train to Oslo the next morning, the three of them sitting in a compartment that smelled of diesel and old upholstery, while winter landscapes scrolled past the windows, frozen lakes, pine forests, small towns huddled against the cold. Marta was quiet, her fingers twisting the engagement ring Eric had given her. What will you say to him? Anna asked. I don't know. What do you say to a stranger who shares half your DNA but none of your history? Marta's laugh was shaky. I keep thinking about how he grew up with Klaus's real name, his real identity, while I grew up with a fiction. You grew up with love, Henrik said. That's more real than any name. The Grand Hotel sat in Oslo's heart, a stately building with the scent of polished wood and old money hanging in its lobby. Thomas Richter had reserved a private sitting room on the second floor, neutral territory, Henrik supposed, for a meeting that carried decades of complicated history. Thomas was waiting when they arrived. He was 42, tall and spare, with Klaus Richter's eyes but a softer mouth that suggested his mother's influence. He stood when they entered, his posture military straight, and for a moment, Henrik was transported back to that April day in 45, staring down at a dying man whose face wore the same sharp features. Marta, Thomas said in careful Norwegian, thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would. Marta studied him with an intensity that made Thomas shift uncomfortably. You look like him. I've been told I have his eyes, but I pray, that's where the resemblance ends. Thomas gestured to chairs arranged around a low table. Please sit. I'll try to explain why I'm here. They settled into an awkward arrangement, coffee service between them like a buffer against the strangeness of this gathering. Thomas began with his childhood in Hamburg, a comfortable life with a mother who'd been both loving and secretive, a father who died during the war under circumstances that were never quite explained. It wasn't until Greta Richter's death the previous year that Thomas found the letters Klaus had sent from Norway between 1942 and 45. They were hidden in a locked box in her closet. Love letters, mostly, talking about his work as a merchant, asking after me, promising to return when the war ended. Thomas's voice roughened. But there were others, later ones, talking about mistakes he'd made, about a woman in Tromsø, about a daughter he'd never intended to have. Me, Marta said flatly. You. Thomas met her gaze. The letters changed tone in 44. He wrote about the Reich collapsing, about being trapped in a role he couldn't escape. He mentioned 12 men dying, and how he couldn't sleep anymore. How every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. Henrik leaned forward. He felt guilt. I don't know if it was guilt or just fear of consequences. But he wrote that you, Marta, were the only pure thing he'd created, and that he'd arranged for your survival with a Norwegian farmer who didn't know the truth. Thomas pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is the last letter he sent my mother. It arrived 3 weeks after the war ended. I think he wrote it the day before he died. He handed it to Marta. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper, German words in Klaus Richter's precise handwriting. Can you translate? She asked Thomas. He nodded and began to read aloud. My dearest Greta, by the time you receive this, I will be dead. The Norwegians have discovered my role, and I will not run. I am too tired, and there is nowhere left to hide. I have failed you in every way a husband can fail. I brought you into a marriage built on duty rather than love, and I gave you a son I barely knew. I have been absent when I should have been present, distant when I should have been warm. But I will not fail Marta. I have arranged for her survival with a good man, simple perhaps, but decent in ways I never was. He will raise her to believe I was a hero, which is the kindest lie I can give her. She will grow up Norwegian, with clean hands and a clear conscience. Tell Thomas when he is old enough to understand that his father was a coward who chose survival over principle. But tell him also that in the end, I tried to do one thing right. Protect the innocent, even if I had to die to do it. Klaus. The room fell silent. Marta's face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He knew he was going to die. He chose it. I think so, yes, Thomas said quietly. The resistance could have killed him quietly, made him disappear. But he orchestrated his own death to look like he died in combat. So you and I could believe in something better than the truth. Henrik thought of Tobias Johansson pulling the trigger, of Gunnar arranging the fiction, of Klaus using his last breath to extract a promise that would shape Marta's entire life. Even in death, the man had been manipulating outcomes, but this time toward something almost redemptive. Why did you come here? Marta asked Thomas. What do you want from me? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I wanted to meet the sister I didn't know I had, to apologize for what our father did, and to ask if... He hesitated. If you would allow me to be part of your life, not to replace anything or intrude, but just to know you, to build something from the ruins he left. Marta looked at Henrik, then Anna, then back at Thomas. I'm getting married in 5 weeks, April 23rd. If you'd like to attend, you're welcome. Thomas's face transformed with relief and gratitude. I would be honored. They spent 3 hours together in that sitting room, sharing stories that began to weave a new narrative from the fragments of the old one. Thomas told them about his childhood, his work as an engineer, his own complicated feelings about Germany's past, and his father's role in it. Marta spoke about growing up on the farm, about Henrik teaching her to fish, and Anna teaching her to bake, about the life they'd built despite, or perhaps because of, the lies that had founded it. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The weight began to lift. Not completely. The past couldn't be erased, and Klaus Richter's crimes remained unchanged. But in acknowledging the full truth, in bringing it into the light, where it could be examined and grieved and finally understood, the poison began to lose its power. As they prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Henrik aside. Thank you, he said simply, for raising her, for being the father our father could never be. Henrik shook his hand, surprised by the firm warmth in the grip. She raised herself mostly. I just tried not to get in the way. That's what good fathers do. On the train ride home, Marta sat between Henrik and Anna, her head on Henrik's shoulder, watching the winter landscape darken into evening. Papa, she said softly. Yes? I'm still angry about the 3 weeks you didn't tell me, but I forgive you. Henrik felt tears sting his eyes. I'm sorry I waited. I was trying to protect you, but you didn't need protection. You needed the truth. You gave me something better, Marta said. You gave me 28 years of believing the world was good. That's worth something. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Norwegian mountains, cold and distant and unchanging. And inside the warm compartment, a family that had been broken by lies began the slow work of rebuilding itself on truth. But the story wasn't over yet, because waiting at the farmhouse when they returned was a telegram from Gunnar Olsen, urgent and brief. Come immediately. Tobias dying. Says he has something to confess about the day Klaus was shot. Something we all got wrong. They found Tobias Johansson in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the slow decay of a body giving up its fight. Lung cancer, Gunnar explained in the hallway outside, his own face haggard with sleeplessness. He's got days, maybe hours. Kept asking for you, Henrik. Wouldn't say why. Just that he needed to set something right before he died. Henrik entered alone, leaving Anna and Marta in the waiting room. Tobias lay propped on pillows, his once solid frame reduced to angles beneath thin blankets. An oxygen tube snaked across his face, and his breathing rattled like wind through broken shutters. But his eyes were sharp when they fixed on Henrik. You came, Tobias rasped. Gunnar said it was urgent. Sit. Tobias gestured weakly to a chair beside the bed. I'm dying, Henrik, and I can't die with this lie. Henrik felt his stomach drop. What lie? About Klaus. About what happened on that road. Tobias's breath wheezed. We told you I shot him. That we executed him for betraying the 12 men. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The room suddenly felt airless. Tell me. Tobias closed his eyes, gathering strength. Klaus knew we were coming for him. We'd been careful, but he was Kriegsmarine intelligence. He'd been trained to spot surveillance. 3 days before we acted, he came to me. Alone. Unarmed. His voice dropped. He asked me to kill him. Henrik gripped the chair's armrest. What? He said the Reich was collapsing, that he couldn't return to Germany. The Gestapo had discovered he'd helped Anna and Marta survive when orders were to eliminate all Norwegian complications. He said if the Germans caught him, they'd torture him for information about resistance networks he'd actually protected. And if he ran, you'd never find Marta. So he chose execution. He chose to die in a way that would give his daughter a father. Tobias's eyes opened, wet with unshed tears. He gave us the time and location, told us exactly how to stage it to look like combat. Asked only that we let him speak to you first, so he could secure the promise. Henrik's mind reeled. Klaus arranged his own death. Down to the bullet placement. He specified where to shoot, lung, not heart, so he'd have time to bleed out slowly. Time to make you swear to find Marta. Tobias coughed, a wet, painful sound. We thought we were executioners, but we were just actors in his final performance. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because Gunnar said it would make Klaus seem noble, like he'd redeemed himself through sacrifice. Tobias's face twisted. But redemption requires remorse, Henrik. And Klaus wasn't sorry for the 12 men. He was only sorry he'd gotten caught. His death wasn't penance. It was strategy. One last manipulation to ensure his daughter's future. Henrik sat back, trying to process this new layer of deception. Klaus Richter had been a spy to the end, using even his own death as a tool. But beneath the manipulation was something Henrik couldn't quite dismiss: a father's desperate love. Klaus had burned every bridge, betrayed every allegiance, and finally surrendered his life. Not for honor or country or ideology, but for a 6-month-old baby girl he'd never meant to create. "There's more," Tobias said weakly. "About the 12 men. About October 44. Henrik leaned forward. "What about them?" "Klaus didn't betray them. Not intentionally." Tobias's breathing grew labored. "We found evidence years later, after the archives opened. The leak came from inside the Norwegian government in exile in London. A secretary working for the British, passing information to the Germans through a double-agent network. Klaus filed reports about our activities. That was his job. But the specific raid coordinates, those came from London." The room tilted. The 12 men died because of a secretary in London? They died because war is chaos and trust is impossible, and sometimes there's no villain, just bad luck and broken systems. Tobias's voice was fading. Klaus was guilty of many things, but their deaths? He carried that guilt unnecessarily. When we shot him, we executed him for a crime he didn't fully commit. Henrik felt the foundations shift again, not Klaus being more innocent than believed, but the resistance fighters being more wrong than they'd known. "Does Gunnar know?" "He knows. Eric and Sindra knew before they died. We kept it from you because what difference did it make?" Klaus was still Kriegsmarine. Still a German officer embedded in our cell. Still someone who'd have killed us all if ordered to. Tobias reached for Henrik's hand with fingers thin as kindling. "But I'm dying, and I can't die knowing you think Klaus betrayed Petter. He didn't. And that matters, because Marta deserves to know her father's worst crime was being a coward, not a murderer." Henrik gripped the dying man's hand. "Why tell me now?" "Because you found the box, because Marta knows the truth, and because she's carrying a burden that's too heavy, thinking her father's hands are stained with the blood of 12 good men." Tobias's breathing grew shallow. "Tell her Klaus was many terrible things, but tell her he wasn't that." "Tobias, promise me, Henrik. One last promise. Tell her." Henrik nodded, his throat tight. "I promise." Tobias's eyes closed, his face relaxing into something like peace. "Thank you," he whispered. "Now I can rest." Henrik sat with Tobias for another hour, holding the old soldier's hand as his breathing grew quieter and finally stopped. Gunnar came in when the nurse had gone, standing at the foot of the bed with his cap in his hands. "He told you," Gunnar said. "Not a question. All of it. We thought we were protecting everyone. Klaus's memory, your peace of mind, Marta's innocence." Gunnar's voice was heavy with exhaustion. But secrets just metastasize. They grow in the dark until they poison everything. Henrik looked at his old commander, this man, who'd kept them alive through 4 years of war and had spent 28 years after carrying the weight of impossible choices. "We all did what we thought was right," Henrik said. "That has to be enough." They buried Tobias 3 days later in the same cemetery where Lars Hagen's memorial stone stood, another name added to the roster of men who'd survived the war but carried its weight until death. At the graveside, Henrik told Marta everything. She listened without interrupting, her hand tight in Eric's, as Henrik explained about Klaus arranging his own execution, about the London leak, about 12 men dying not because of Klaus's direct betrayal, but because of the vast, chaotic machinery of war that ground up innocent and guilty alike. "So my father wasn't a mass murderer," Marta said when Henrik finished. "Just a spy who tried to protect his daughter at the end." "He was complicated," Henrik said. "Human in the worst and best ways. He made terrible choices, but his final choice was for you." Marta stood silent for a long moment, looking at the rows of stones marking men who'd fought and died and been remembered. Then she turned to the memorial stone Henrik had erected 28 years ago. "We should add his real name," she said quietly. "Klaus Richter, 1920 to 1945. He doesn't deserve to be remembered as a hero, but he deserves to be remembered truthfully." Henrik felt pride surge through him, his daughter choosing honesty over comfortable fiction. "We'll commission a new stone," he agreed, "after your wedding." The wedding took place on April 23, 1973, in a small church in Lillehammer that smelled of lilies and beeswax. Marta wore a simple dress, her mother's pearls, and the expression of hard-won peace. Thomas Richter sat in the third row, beside Gunnar and the few surviving resistance fighters who'd known Klaus and chosen to attend anyway. Anna cried quietly throughout the ceremony. Eric's vows were tender and sincere, and when the officiant asked who gave this woman in marriage, Henrik stood and said clearly, "Her family does. All of us." At the reception in the church hall, Marta found Henrik standing alone by the window, watching snow fall unseasonably late into spring. "Thank you, Papa," she said, linking her arm through his. "For what?" "For telling me the truth, even when it hurt. For loving me when you learned what Klaus had done. For being the father I needed, instead of the father I was born to." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Klaus Richter gave me life. But you gave me everything else." Henrik held his daughter, feeling the decades of love and fear and hope compressed into this single moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ground in white that would melt by morning, leaving behind the dark earth where new things could grow. "I have something for you," Marta said, pulling back. She withdrew a small box from her pocket and handed it to Henrik. Inside was a silver compass, worn with age. "It was Klaus's," she explained. "Thomas brought it. Said his mother kept it all these years. I thought you should have it. A reminder that even when we're lost, we can find our way home." Henrik turned the compass in his hands, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing north with unwavering certainty. "Keep it," he said, closing her fingers around the box. "You're the one starting a new journey. Let it guide you." As the reception continued, laughter and music and the clink of glasses toasting new beginnings, Henrik watched his daughter dance with her new husband, surrounded by family, both blood and chosen. Klaus Richter had been a spy, a coward, and a man who'd caused suffering he couldn't undo. But in his final act, he'd given Marta to Henrik. And from that gift, something good had grown. The past couldn't be changed. But the future was still being written, one choice at a time, by people who'd learned that love mattered more than lineage, and that family was something you built, not something you inherited. Years later, when people asked Marta about her father, she would tell them the truth, that she'd been born to a German spy, raised by a Norwegian farmer, and loved by both in the complicated ways that humans love, when war and secrets and time conspire to break and rebuild them. It wasn't a simple story, but it was hers. And that was enough. 15 years passed like pages turning in a well-worn book. Henrik was 63 when he finally returned to the road near Björkvik, where Klaus Richter had died. Not as Lars Hagen, the hero, but as himself, orchestrating his own end with the same cold precision he'd brought to everything else. The spring air carried the scent of thawing earth and pine sap, and the mountains stood eternal against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Henrik had driven north alone, telling Anna only that he needed to see the place one final time before his memory began to fail him the way it was failing so many men his age. But memory wasn't what drove him here. It was closure. The roadside looked different now, paved smooth, marked with reflective posts. Nothing like the muddy track where he'd knelt in 45 holding a dying man's hand. But Henrik knew the spot by the angle of the mountain, by the curve of the creek that still ran cold and clear 50 meters east. He parked the truck and walked to where it had happened. Marta was 37 now, mother to 2 children, a boy named Henrik and a girl named Anna. She taught history at the university in Hamar, specializing in the complexities of collaboration and resistance during occupation. Her dissertation had examined how ordinary people navigated impossible moral choices, and though she never said so directly, Henrik knew Klaus Richter's story threaded through every page. Thomas visited twice a year, an honorary uncle to Marta's children, a bridge between German and Norwegian branches of a family that shouldn't exist, but did. He'd married a woman from Bremen, a librarian who shared Marta's love of complicated histories, and their Christmas cards showed a life of quiet contentment. Anna still made Sunday dinners, still kept the farmhouse running with the same efficient grace she'd brought to 33 years of marriage built on lies that had somehow transformed into truth. And the memorial stone in Lillehammer's cemetery now bore both names: Lars Hagen, Klaus Richter, 1920-1945, father, spy, human. He died so his daughter could live, not hero, not villain, just the messy, complicated truth. Henrik knelt in the grass where Klaus had bled out, running his fingers through soil that had absorbed that blood decades ago, returned it to the earth, made it part of the endless cycle of decay and renewal. I kept my promise, Henrik said to the empty road. She grew up good, kind. She has your eyes, but nothing of your capacity for deception. Whatever you were, whatever you did, she's proof that we're more than our origins. A raven called from a nearby pine, its voice harsh and ancient. Henrik pulled the tin box from his truck. He'd kept it all these years, unable to burn it, unable to completely let go. Inside were the photographs, the documents, the letters, and one item he'd never shown Marta, a small notebook in Klaus's handwriting, discovered at the very bottom, beneath the false bottom that had held the second letter. It was a diary of sorts, entries spanning from November 1942 to April 1945. Henrik had read it only once, 15 years ago, and never opened it again. But now, kneeling in the spring sunshine with the mountains watching, he read it again. The entries were sparse, clinical at first. Coordinates, patrol schedules, the kind of intelligence work Klaus had been sent to do. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted. Notes about Anna appeared. She laughs like wind chimes. I have no right to that sound. Then about Marta's birth. I held her today, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. I felt something I thought the war had burned out of me. The entries from 44 grew darker. October 15, 1944, 12 men died today because I filed reports. I tell myself I was only doing my job, that someone in London made the final betrayal, but their blood is on my hands regardless. I dream of them now. Petter Johansson singing. Olaf Berg carving a bird from driftwood. I know their names. That makes it worse. December 3rd, 1944. Marta smiled at me today. Anna doesn't know what I am. No one knows except the people in Berlin, and they're losing the war. I could run, disappear into Germany as it collapses, but Marta would grow up fatherless, and Anna would be left alone with a traitor's child. There has to be another way. March 21st, 1945. The Norwegians are suspicious. I see it in how they watch me now, how conversations stop when I enter rooms. Gunnar knows, maybe others. I have perhaps 2 weeks before they act. April 18th, 1945. I have made my decision. I will arrange to die in a way that gives Marta a future. Henrik Andersen is simple but good. Exactly the kind of man who will keep a promise to a dying friend. He'll raise her Norwegian. She'll never know what I was. That's the kindest gift I can give her. April 22nd, 1945. Tomorrow. I've told Tobias where to find me, specified exactly how to stage it. I'm not afraid of death, I've earned it. I'm only afraid I won't have time to make Henrik promise. Everything depends on those final minutes. The final entry was dated April the 23rd, 1945, written in the early morning before Klaus went to meet his executioners. If anyone reads this, if Marta somehow finds this years from now, know that I was not brave. I was a coward who chose survival over principle for 3 years. But in the end, I chose her. That doesn't redeem me. Nothing can. But it's the truest thing I ever did. To Marta, you were the only good thing I created. Everything else was destruction. To Henrik, thank you for keeping a promise to a monster. You're the father I could never be. Klaus Henrik closed the notebook, his eyes burning. Even here, even in private writing never meant to be read, Klaus had been calculating, crafting a narrative, shaping perception. But beneath the manipulation was something Henrik had spent 15 years learning to recognize. Genuine love, warped by years of deception, but real nonetheless. Klaus Richter had been incapable of honest relationships, but he'd been capable of sacrifice. That had to count for something. Henrik buried the notebook there, beside the road, in a hole he dug with his bare hands. He covered it with earth and stones, marking the spot with nothing because some truths didn't need memorials. They just needed to be released into the ground, where they could finally rest. As he drove back toward Lillehammer, his phone rang. Marta, her voice bright with news that her daughter Anna had just won a school award for an essay about her great-grandfather's farm, about resilience and family and the land that held them together. She wants you to come to the ceremony next week, Marta said. Will you? I wouldn't miss it, Henrik replied, and meant it, because this was what mattered. Not the sins of the past, but the choices of the present. The way each generation had the chance to build something better than what came before. Klaus Richter had given Marta life, but he'd also given her to Henrik. And from that twisted beginning, something clean had grown. A family that chose each other every day, that faced truth without flinching, that understood love was stronger than blood and more enduring than secrets. The farmhouse appeared on the horizon, white clapboards solid against the evening sky, smoke rising from the chimney where Anna was making dinner, the same kitchen table waiting where 4 generations had shared meals and stories and the complicated work of being human. Henrik pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, watching light glow in the windows. Somewhere in Germany, Klaus Richter's legitimate son was putting his own children to bed, carrying forward his father's name without his father's sins. Somewhere in Hamar, Marta was helping her daughter rehearse the speech she'd give, teaching her that history was complicated, and that's what made it worth studying. And here, in this farmhouse that had weathered war and secrets and time, Anna waited with dinner and conversation and 33 years of choosing each other despite everything. The compass Marta had given him at her wedding sat on Henrik's dashboard, Klaus's compass, pointing north with unwavering certainty, a reminder that even when lost, there was always a way home. Henrik picked it up, feeling the weight of decades in his palm. Then he went inside, where his wife was waiting, where the table was set for two, where the life they'd built from lies had become more true than any fiction. Some say that on quiet nights near Björkvik, you can still hear two men talking on the roadside, one asking for a promise, one giving it, neither knowing that the girl they were bargaining over would grow up to teach others that we're all more than our worst moments, and that family is what you build when you refuse to let the past define your future. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, so you never miss the stories that remind us what it means to be human. And tell us in the comments, have you ever learned a truth that changed everything you thought you knew? Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we carry in our own hearts.